Hi, I am Luke McKnight, and this is my final multimedia presentation on food deserts in rural America. So, as my first slide, just a general introduction to what food deserts are. Food deserts are, in the most simplified sense, areas with limited access to affordable and nutritional food. I'm sorry. Um, in general, food deserts can reside everywhere, whether it be urban or rural. Of course, in this particular presentation, we'll be focusing on rural. But to go off of that facet and that fact is that actually larger amounts of urban areas are considered to be food deserts. Now, this can, of course, be attributed to just simply that urban areas just are going to be larger. They're just going to hold more land in general. And in accordance, it would just make more sense that there would be a larger amount of urban area actually attributed to food deserts. Now, while this is true, according to USDA, some 40.5 million Americans reside in food deserts or areas in which nutritious food is hard to come by. Now, going off of that second fact, talking about um, urban areas being larger, the amount of people actually living in food deserts is greater in rural areas. Even while the land area is something like double that in rural areas, I'm sorry, it's double in the urban areas as in the rural. There are actually still more people located in these rural food deserts. Now, moving on to the second slide, we have the impact of food deserts in rural Appalachia. I wanted to choose this area in particular because one, it's just one I know a little bit more about. Part of my family resides here in West Virginia, and just it generally gives me a better grasp on this area in akin to others. In rural Appalachia, food deserts present quite unique challenges. Of course, limited access being one of the biggest one, and residents traveling long distances to find food. They're again singling out West Virginia here for a second. Depending on the county you're in, as you can see in this map, there are certain ones that are almost entirely red. Say the farther south you get, the more common ultimately that they become, as it is just a poor area of the state. As such, a pretty large percentage actually have to travel to places like a food or a pantry or a church or any such service giving out food to actually do that. Now, say for example, church that is in most places quite close by, but in other such areas where this such service is not available, it becomes far more difficult. Um, Health efforts, of course, increase rates of diet-related diseases such as obesity and diabetes. Food deserts, in and of themselves, yes, obviously, are something where availability to food is more difficult. It also means availability to fresh food. One such area may still have a way of getting food to one another through something like a grocery store or a corner shop, for example. But they're getting mostly junk food. They're getting potato chips. They're getting soda. It's just high fructose corn syrup, anything that's incredibly processed. Whereas fresh food is just far more difficult to transport to these areas and such as get them, leading to increased cases of obesity and diabetes, along with many other weight related health problems. There's also the facet of the community well being, whereas food insecurity affects mental health and overall quality of life, especially living in a country that so many consider to be so rich. Seeing that there is essentially over 1 in 10 Americans are facing living in a food desert or some improper access to food in relation to the United States as a whole. And while, of course, this doesn't just affect physical health, it can also affect mental health in the general sense that it can just really just be demoralizing to know that you just are not able to feed yourself. Especially this is encouraged and seen higher in units like families, where, of course, our dependents like children and other such things. Addressing these issues is vital for improving health outcome in these communities. Now, while, of course, this is not the only health problem to consider, that ravages communities. For example, there being the opioid crisis, as well as just greater rates of smoking cigarettes. If such a problem like this were to be combated, it would be a lot easier to improve the health of these communities overall. Moving on to the next slide, we have policy solutions. My apologies, let me put this up here. Policy solutions for addressing food deserts. There are several different initiatives, more than what's included on the slide, but these are some of the bigger ones. Supporting farmers market, for instance, programs that promote local markets can increase fresh produce availability, as I had described in a different slide. The lack of availability of fresh food can at times be an even larger problem than the lack of food itself. Again, some of these areas are actually in close proximity to a grocery store or just a general shop, but it may be in places that are more can do a hotter climate, like the more desert areas of the West, or in the more mountainous areas of Appalachia, for example. Once again, now of course, while fresh produce is not absolutely impossible to grow in these areas, if they are grown in say places more like northern West Virginia or across the border in Ohio and Kentucky, um, not only is it more difficult and more costly to transport these, but they just might not get them in the first place, seeing as it just might not be worth it to transport these communities that have only a couple hundred people in them, unfortunately. There's also, of course, food assistance programs. This one's a little bit more difficult as this requires a greater amount of state and federal support in relation to some others, which may just be an initiative one can do among as an individual or even rallying a group of people together and doing it through NGOs or such other individual actions. But things like SNAP benefits and other such food stamps, while I know to some there might be a stigma, in other areas may be that life-saving resource that others need when they are not able to afford healthier foods or just food in general for that matter. Um, Further case studies and successful ones alongside that is a massive ways of discovering and implementing what would be better interventions. Food deserts as a whole have really been understudied. As far as I could tell, my research on the topic, that it has been around really less than 40 years since any large scale research has been done on such a subject. And it has really only been since the 2000s and during the early Obama era that we actually got true case studies and records of just how many people actually live in these areas and proper identification through organizations like the USDA. There's also, as mentioning, with needing state federal support, if the support is to be garnered, collaboration is a key factor in establishing these people, these communities, and just further helping them as much as possible, and just generally increasing and expediting these efforts to these communities. Excuse me. Come on. Don't need to watch that video, but it is about community gardens. Talking about infrastructure for a second and improvements for food access. Enhancing transportation would be a massive way of properly getting food sources to be reached. Sometimes it's not even about the cost or even getting resources there. Well, it is about getting the resources there, but more in the way that it just simply becomes too difficult to get products there. Like, say, again, taking the mountainous areas of Appalachia. There will absolutely be less developed communities that may only be existing off of dirt or gravel roads, and therefore aren't allowing for the infrastructure of not only just a large grocery store, but even just the transport network in order to actually get to that area. Which again, something like a community garden or so on and so forth, something similar would be at least a similar direction for solving that issue, along with other changes to infrastructure. More local food distribution. This is again going back to food pantries and food banks, where if maybe such products are able to be held in more bulk, and it's through a nonprofit program or one that is government supported, that can offset costs of actually getting the resource there in the first place, and can allow for it to be not only a more trustworthy source of distribution, but one that is just practically more doable in every way. And we can also take the examples of more successful projects already, such as community-supported agriculture programs. Again, we've already mentioned this a bunch of times, but if you were to include one that has not yet been mentioned in this presentation, one could go about arguing setting up more an actual organization of like not just one singular community garden resulting in one place, but you could spread that out to more people's housing and just encouraging a general gardening program in my houses for one. Not only would this, I don't want to say completely free, because of course you need those resources that first plant it and take care of them, but at the very least, once they are ready to harvest, you not only have your own supply, you are being self-reliable, and you're generally just you're allowing your community to be more healthy and just allowing for better food distribution, as well as general investments along those stems. Some strategies for individuals and communities themselves. Residents can adopt these practical strategies to navigate food deserts. Again, I've already mentioned community gardens, stack. I want to keep repeating myself here because these are generally just a very popular one, and one that has been shown to work already in communities like this. It's not always easy to get off the ground, and it does take the cooperation of an entire local community, which at times, of course, can be difficult, but as such organization is mustered, it makes it a lot easier. General nutrition education, the younger the better in this regard. Teaching healthy cooking and eating on a budget. Now, of course, this is not solely applicable to children. There is very easily adults in this world and in this country who have just generally not learned this, whether it be just lack of learning or never having those resources there in the first place. But again, the younger the better. And if this were to be taught to children in the first place, gets cut off a lot sooner, more resources are saved, so on and so forth. Resource sharing, I've already mentioned this, creating that new strategy of allowing gardens in each person's backyard. This is especially in a community that people are more tight knit and just already aware of this issue that's existing in their community. It's something, so on and so forth, blah, 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 blah. It's also empowering communities to take action and can lead to healthier choices. This can include um, just overall allowing for this greater amount of resources. It can not only make a community feel proud of themselves, like, wow, this is my own food. I'm making my community better by doing this, and I'm making people healthier. Finally, adding on to conclusion and a call to action. In summary, food deserts pose significant challenges, particularly in places like rural Appalachia or just generally more mountainous and more rural areas for that matter. Addressing these issues require collaborative efforts from educators, policymakers, and community members. It emphasizes the importance of access to healthy foods and can lead to private health incomes. Let's work together and get rid of these food deserts.